This is my my program. Point one is I want to scare you, because I know that's the only way that I'm going to get to have any effect at all. Secondly, I want to educate you a little bit and say a few words about the different injury mechanisms, and we'll end by discussing preventive measures. You might not be completely satisfied by point three, because it's very hard to give a very global description of what you need to do. It depends very much on what type of laser you work with, what the conditions are that you work with, so I will not be able to give you much specifics. If I've succeeded in point one, then the best thing to do is to borrow some of the books that we have on laser safety and work out what you need to do to address your particular situation. And I'd be more than happy to help you with it if you have any specific questions. So the basic purpose really is to change the attitude of people who are using lasers. I mean, we all have the tendency of saying, well, this won't happen to me, and you will hear these words a few times today. It will happen to some of us. It has happened to some of us. And the only real safety precautions, at least as far as dealing with eye injuries, is to wear glasses. Case history number one. The necessity for safety precautions with high-power lasers. This is actually an accident that happened over 20 years ago, and what was high power then would make us laugh right now. I mean, it's a factor, you know, million to a billion less than what current lasers have. The necessity for safety precautions with high-power lasers was forcibly brought home to me last January when I was partially blinded by a reflection from a relatively weak neodymium-YAG laser beam. Retinal damage resulted from a 6 millijoule, 10 nanosecond pulse of invisible 1064 nanometer radiation. I was not wearing protective goggles at the time, although they were available in the laboratory. As any experienced laser researcher knows, goggles not only cause tunnel vision and become fogged, they become very uncomfortable after several hours in the laboratory. When the beam struck my eye, I heard a distinct popping sound caused by a laser-induced explosion at the back of my eyeball. My vision was obscured almost immediately by streams of blood floating in the vitreous humor, which is, you know, the sort of watery center of the eye, and by what appeared to be particulate matter suspended in the vitreous humor. It was like viewing the world through a round fishbowl full of glycerol into which a quart of blood and a handful of black pepper had been partially mixed. There was local pain within a few minutes of the accident. The most immediate response after such an accident is horror. As a Vietnam War veteran, I have seen several terrible scenes of human carnage, but none affected me more than viewing the world through my blood-filled eyeball. In the aftermath of the accident, I went into shock, as is typical in personal injury accidents. As it turns out, my injury was severe, but not nearly as bad as it might have been. I was not looking directly at the prism from which the beam had reflected, so the retinal damage is not in the fovea. That's the part of the eye that has the highest density of nerves and that you use for, let's say, reading. And the optic nerve, the beam struck my retina between the fovea and the optic nerve, missing the optic nerve by about 3 millimeters. Had the focused beam struck the fovea, I should have sustained a blind spot in the center of my field of vision. Had it struck the optic nerve, I would probably have lost sight of that eye. The beam did strike so close to the optic nerve, however, that it cut through nerve fiber bundles radiating from the optic nerve. This has resulted in a crescent-shaped blind spot many times the size of the lesion. The effect of the large blind area is much like having a finger placed over one's field of vision. Also, I still have numerous floating objects in the field of view of my damaged eye, although the blood streamers have disappeared. There's also recurrent pain in the eye, especially when I've been reading too long or when I get tired. Needless to say, it's irreversible. These things do not heal. Okay, let's briefly first look at the electromagnetic spectrum here, a plot you've probably seen many times. Lasers operate anywhere from, the ultraviolet to the infrared. And in terms of laser safety, they basically fall into three categories: ultraviolet, which is smaller than 350 nanometers, ocular focus, which is the region from 350 nanometers to 1.4 micron. You'll see in a second why that is. And infrared, anything larger than 1.4 microns. Most of the lasers that are used in labs for light scattering, pumping of amplifiers, and so on, fall into this ocular focus region. It's called the ocular focus region because if you look at the transmission of the eye, the cornea transmits light in this region, a much broader range actually than the visible range. So this means that there is a visible ocular focus range from 350 to 700 nanometers, and then there's an invisible range between 700 nanometers and 1.4 micron. This is perhaps the most dangerous region of the electromagnetic spectrum as far as laser safety is concerned, because the light penetrates into your eye, strikes the retina, gets, the intensity goes up by a factor of 1,000, 10,000, depending on how well it's focused, and usually it's well focused because unless you're reading, your eye accommodates to looking at a distance, which means that a collimated beam gets focused onto your retina. And it easily causes damage without you actually seeing the beam. So if there's a beam in the invisible ocular focus region that travels off your optical table, you are unaware of it. You don't see it hit your skin or your clothing or anything until it gets into your eye, and then it gets focused onto the retina. So laser hazards are numerous, although there's only one that I will discuss, namely radiation hazard. There's of course electrical hazards, chemical, mechanical hazards. I mean, if you work with high power pulsed lasers, they often have capacitors that can store many joules of energy, like pulsed CO2 lasers, for example. And some of the argon, the old argon ion lasers have power supplies that that run on 3-phase and have 40 amps, 440 volts. So there are many electrical hazards. I won't discuss these because I think there's a separate electrical safety seminar. Chemical hazards, if you use dye lasers, many dyes are carcinogens, and you work with solvents that easily penetrate the skin. So if you spill some of those dyes, carcinogenic dyes in a solvent, you have to be particularly aware of the chemical hazards. But I will basically talk about radiation hazards, and you can get both skin damage as well as eye damage. Skin damage is generally not severe unless you work with lasers like NOVA or the National Ignition Facility. I think the type of lasers used in an academic environment, you might be able to get a burn spot on your skin, but nothing that would be irreversible. In the eye, unfortunately, it is irreversible. A single hit by a laser spot in the eye above the damage threshold, which is extremely low, with femtosecond pulses such as the ones we are using in our lab, it can be as low as tens of And it's permanent. It's irreversible. It does not heal. In other words, you create a damaged spot on your retina and you have to live with a damaged spot the rest of your life. The brain somehow filters it out after a while, but if it's in the fovea so that it actually damages a central spot of your vision, that eye will then no longer be able to actually resolve letters on a printed page. You will not be able to read, even though you still might have peripheral vision. So the damage mechanisms are listed here. CW lasers, continuous wave lasers, cause thermal damage when the exposure is sufficiently long or the laser intensity is sufficiently high. In some cases, photochemical degeneration, and even if it's low-level chronic exposure, you have to be careful, just like, you know, welders have to be careful about the intensity of the light that comes off the welding arc. So in other words, well, we'll talk to that later. Pulse lasers involve a whole other category of damage. It's really like a bullet of photons that is traveling. There are many different absorption processes taking place, such as nonlinear absorption. And even for radiation that does not easily get absorbed at a certain wavelength, you can get absorption with femtosecond pulses because of these nonlinear effects. And we'll see that there are different physical parameters that are important for CW and pulsed lasers. Those parameters are, in general, wavelengths, as we've seen, because that determines where the energy gets deposited, on the cornea or in the back of the retina. And for CW lasers, the important quantity is power density, whereas for pulse lasers, the important parameter is energy density. So watt per square centimeter when you have a CW laser, and joules per square centimeter when we're talking about pulse lasers.